Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Rolo Slavskiy, aka Rurik Skywalker, ambassador for all Slavs, advocate for Slavic interests, who writes at Slavland Chronicles.substack.com. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire for the first time, Rurik.
Thanks for having me. And well, what happened actually was Rolo quit. He was so frustrated with the quality of the Russia discourse that he said, "I've had enough. I'm quitting," and he handed over the blog to me, Rurik, and so that's what happened, and that's where we're at right now. So I'm a little bit more patient. Rolo was a prophet. I think everyone understands that he was a genius. He was ahead of his time. He was just like this amazing all-around person, perfect, flawless in every regard. I think, objectively speaking, and I'm not, I have no bias here at all. I'm just saying it how it is. I'm a little bit more modest as a writer, and I'm trying to sort of ease people into seeing the conflict in a different way. And so I think that's the big difference between me and Rolo Slavskiy. May his memory live on forever. I hope that explains that to you.
So. Yeah, and I came across your blog early on, your Substack, and it's very unique. We chatted before on my TNT show, and you're looking at things from a unique vantage point, and I think on a number of issues we see eye to eye, and so I wanted to get sort of your latest, updated big picture view before drilling into some of the details. Your big picture view on the grand globalist chessboard, as I like to call it, citing the late Zbigniew Brzezinski. And is it really East versus West, or is something else going on? We've both interviewed folks like Yuri Roshka, the ex-Moldovan politician, who sheds some light there. But, your thoughts on what's going on right now in the world, especially with East versus West and this whole multipolarity talk.
Well, there are elements of the agenda that I'm not expert on, and there are people who read the actual stuff, the stuff that these people put out. I'm more of like a historian in the sense that I try to figure out how we got here, and I try to read past documents and into past trends that brought us up to this point. And so one of the main things I do is I analyze Soviet history and the real Soviet history. And it's for most people, it's very emotional and propaganda driven, whether they're on the east or the west side of the divide. But objectively, if you look at what was really going on, you start seeing that there's this agenda which starts really rearing its head, which I call Convergence, and that's the name that it was given by its primary proponents. And it's this idea of creating a one world elite, a one world government, and about merging the elites of East and West. And to do that, you have to smooth over any ideological inconsistencies. And you just have to do these. You have to create international organizations, conferences. You have to create a network of economic interdependence. You have to create a shared ideology, a shared worldview. You have to basically split the pie in some way that is amenable to most people. And that is basically what the agenda has been on higher levels. So the elite, I think, was not, people have a hard time understanding the tyranny of small differences, or the fact that people can hate each other over small differences. So even within the elite, like I say that the Moscow elite is 99 or 95% in agreement with the Western elite on everything. And yet, yes, there is conflict between them. And you could point in history to say like the battles between one royal family against another, or within one royal family, or like a civil war in some country. And with the gift of hindsight and some distance from the events where we can be unemotional, we look at it and we're like, these people pretty much all believe the same thing. Like they're all feudal lords. They're basically ideologically aligned. They're just sort of competing over who gets to be the boss, or they're competing over a slice of the pie. Like it's like a company competing with another company over who can squeeze out an extra % of profit in the cereal products line or something like that. That's the best way to conceptualize this. We are being told that it is an ideological, like a refutation or a rebuking of what the Western elites are doing. So they're, that's the way that the narrative is driven for us, that it's this complete repudiation of SJWism or this whatever this ideology is, like this woke communism, globalism thing. Mostly they say globalism. They say that Russia and China, and sometimes they add Iran, are fighting against this globalist ideology. It's a total rejection of it on an economic basis, on a spiritual basis, on a political basis, geopolitical, whatever. And that's just not true. Even in Iran, I think if people were to investigate a little bit more the mullahs, or in China, who created China, how is China integrated into the globalist system, they'd find out that really these people, again, are in agreement about 90+% of everything. But that doesn't mean, people who have small disagreements are still willing to fight bitter wars. I mean, look at you and your behavior with your friends or something like that. We all know that petty disagreements can be the source of a lot of strife. So the assumption that just because they're in some kind of a visible conflict now, that this means that they have totally diametric worldviews and world plans is an assumption that it's tempting to make, it's comforting to make, but there's no proof of it. And they cannot explain how this divergence could have come about, because anyone who has studied, for example, the Soviet history — I'm not a big expert on China, I know enough about it to say that, okay, they're also part of this whole transition to a globalized everything. And a lot of people have also deduced that. But with the Soviet Union, I have the advantage of, I actually know what I'm talking about. I've studied it pretty in depth, pretty extensively. And it's just something that anyone who studies it would be floored, or they would be stumped by the explanations given by today's propagandists, who claim that Russia's this Christian, anti-globalist, anti-communist, anti all the bad things country, because you have to point to a certain moment when Russia stopped being all those things, because we know that Russia was all those things under the Soviet Union, and you can just trace it. And then all of a sudden we have Yeltsin, and we know Yeltsin's up to yeah. I'm just saying, someone has to explain to me at what point Russia became this incredible fighter for all the good things. And I have nothing against Russia. I mean, I guess the government, the elites, at what point did the elites become these anti-globalists? Show me at the historical point when the continuity that was broken from what was before and what we have now. And they can't point to it. It's just like a miracle. Like at some point, everyone had a change of heart. You know what I'm saying? That was the main point I was trying to get at.
Yeah, and you were breaking up, but you came back, and I was gonna mention, I was a couple of years back, went to Russia with Center for Citizens Initiatives with Sharon Tennyson, 30 of us Americans on this peace diplomacy mission. We were with Gorbachev for 2 hours. I got to shake hands with him, Vladimir Bosner, and then I went to Kazan, Tatarstan, and then they showed us Orthodox Church, where they told us a story of how during the Soviet Union, they filled the church with people standing like to the max, like sardines in a can. And then they would throw them from the roof of the church and kill them. And then, when I was living in Kazakhstan, also part of the Soviet Union, they told us stories as well, that in the churches there, they would come during the Soviet Union and all the men would disappear. And in the early days, century ago, they'd build the church, government confiscates it, they build it again, they destroy it, so on and so forth. And so, as you say, I would agree with you. There doesn't really seem to be a big switch over. But just to go back to what you were talking about, I would agree with you on this concept of convergence. Others, like Anthony Sutton, wrote about this many years ago. And it's funny, Yuri Roshka, actually, he asked me, like, why don't I write an article? Because I likened it to two Mexican cartels, right? And I don't have time to write. And so, but Juan Grillo, who I've had on the podcast, he's one of like the top journalists on Mexico. He tweets a couple days ago. He says, the idea there are duopolies of power in Mexico between the cartels and the government in many states, such as Sinaloa or Tamaulipas, explains a lot how things work. Sometimes those two spheres of power work together, but sometimes they are at war. And so when you're talking about East versus West, I liken it to cartels. They have the same methods, right? Extortion, murder, chopping heads off, killing, stealing. But sometimes they butt heads. Would you think that's a good analogy?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. If we're talking tactics and techniques, well, there isn't really that much daylight between what Russia's been doing. I mean, it's just, I guess, measures of, I think most people would point out that, the cartels probably more extreme, take things to the logical conclusion a little bit more than the government, which still is, like, I don't know how it is in Mexico, but perhaps there's similarities, but there's still differences of scale and proportion. And for sure, in Ukraine, the repression has been extreme. I mean, we've all seen people being taped and beaten, and it's like, who even are these people? Who are these supposed traitors? I don't think that they were Russian spies. I don't think Russia was actively doing any of the things that they were accused of doing, because if that would imply Russia was competent and was actually trying to win this war. No, I think it was just a witch hunt, hysteria. The worst impulses, mob mentality was unleashed in Ukraine, and you didn't have that in Russia, and that's obviously much better. But in other things, both countries had COVID shutdowns. Both countries are run by gangs of psychopathic oligarchs. The spook state is completely totalitarian, overreaching, meddling with people on levels that I think would appall most people, in the sense of like stealing businesses from people, stealing humanitarian aid, stealing from the soldiers, harassing journalists, locking up people like Strelkov, who I think we're going to talk about today. Just doing stuff on that level. Both countries have that. Both countries assassinate, or for some reason, people who state unpopular opinions that are unpopular with the ruling elite, they tend to disappear. It's just, for some reason, their life expectancy is shortened, and no one can prove anything, of course, but trends do exist like that in both countries. So, and when we compare it to, say, America, I'm tempted to quote Edward Lemonov, who spent some time in the West, and then he came back to Russia, and he created this sort of political agitation group, activist group, that was also anti-Kremlin, but from like an extreme sort of right-wing perspective. Anyway, his thing was that he saw the same methods at work in the West as in the Soviet Union. He just saw that they were more refined in the West, that they didn't need these jackboot wearing thugs breaking into people's apartments. They didn't need to send the police out with batons to break up protesting students, that they had achieved compliance through much cleverer means. Yes, if they needed to, they would the regime would show its true face, and it would be very similar to what you have in the East. It's just they're more competent, and so they don't need to rely on the same strong-arm tactics that you have in the East. The propaganda is more refined. The social pressure is more refined. The social reforms have been more sweeping. The community and the trust between the citizenry has been more thoroughly eroded. Civic society has been more thoroughly infiltrated. So he had all these interesting arguments. But yes, it's like what you said. It's two rival gangs. The tactics at their core are the same. It's just, sure, you could make an argument about proportion and scale, because so Strelkov, who is this critic of the war effort from the perspective of, he thinks that the Kremlin government is pro-Western, it's compromised, that they're self-sabotaging, or that they're not willing to take measures that need to be taken because they're getting orders from Langley. He has a track record of being involved in a bunch of pro-Russian causes, like in Transnistria and in Serbia and obviously in Donbass, where he was one of the main instigators of the armed rebellion. So he was arrested and he was sentenced, and we don't know really what the charges were because it was secret charges. Most of the proceedings, the relevant parts, were kept secret, and we don't even understand. So we don't understand like how he broke the law. We don't understand. But so yes, people in the West are arrested. They get their banks accounts confiscated. They get set up by the feds, or they get implicated in like the January 6th protesters. There's a lot of fishy stuff. There's a lot of this sort of black psyops going on in the West for sure. But do they ever just straight up barge into someone's house and arrest him for stating opinions that the regime does not find flattering? No, they have much better methods. They have much softer coercive methods. But in Russia, they have to use.
I would just add here a few examples, and I agree with you. By and large, in the West, they don't do that. That's more common in places like Russia or China or somewhere, maybe the Middle East. But the very first guest on my podcast over a decade ago, which initially was called Dissident Thinker, was Corporal Thorson, and he was he was in the military. And what happened was, is in the US, he was privately on social media, Facebook, whatever, not publicly, but just in private messaging between friends and family, discussing how 9/11 was an inside job or whatever. Because of that, the secret police in the US, and there's video of this, they went to his house and they renditioned him, basically. They took him like totally insane. I think they were going to put him in a mental hospital. And then John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute, who's also been a guest on my podcast, he got him out. And so this does happen in the US, but I think it's much more, in this case, I think it was a soldier who was speaking the truth. And in the West, because they worship the war industry, Americans, they will listen more closely to a soldier. And so the government's like, we can't have this guy talking about 9/11. But I just wanted to say that it does happen, but I think it's few and far between. Look at me, in 2 years ago, the Department of Homeland Security took me off of PayPal. And so they've got all these other methods.
Yeah, I've been banned off PayPal and I'm a nobody. Like, it's incredible. And nobody, I've had, no one wants to talk about this, but like, because it's a stigma, but I've basically been harassed by spooks in America and in Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And I'm literally nobody. Like I get 3,000 people reading. This was even before I had a blog. I was just a person of interest, because I'm well educated, I guess, and which means well indoctrinated, right? And because I travel a lot, and my family was not exactly just peasants. So there you go. Everyone and no one wants to talk about, like, people on Twitter that I personally knew who had 30,000 followers. That's much more than I have, but that's still nothing really in terms of Twitter terms. They were getting visits by the FBI. Some people I knew that attended a rally like 10 years ago got visited by the FBI last year. And, some guy who worked as a journalist, like a lowly journalist somewhere, he was visited by the spooks as well. He told me his story, and he was like shocked. He was like, I thought I was just like a blogger. No one cares. They do care. This is happening everywhere. They go to YouTube influencers. They go to Instagram influencers. They go to bloggers. They go to people who finished good schools. They go to people with with military connections or familial connections in some way with the government. There's lots of books that have been written about this sort of thing. It's a widespread phenomenon. And I think people are just in denial about it because it's scary, or because they're scared because they themselves have been approached and no one wants to break the taboo, or because they're afraid that people will consider them crazy because, oh, you're just imagining it. No one could take an interest in you. You're just sort of puffing yourself up. So there's this is the sort of the softer methods of coercion. Like you mentioned, trying to commit someone into a psychiatric hospital. Well, that's a standard Soviet tactic, except what they would do is they'd show up and they'd throw you literally like into a straitjacket and haul you off to be chemically or otherwise lobotomized and beaten and yelled at and messed with. Right? In America, though, they encourage you to turn yourself in. Right? They'll come up with all these weird diseases and illnesses that you can self-diagnose yourself with. They have a nice, friendly counselor in every single school who says, you might be experiencing gender dysphoria, and I have just the thing for you, just the surgery for you, young man or young lady. And they do all this in a much more clever way. I think for sure that this is a point worth stressing. And again, in Russia, like you feel the spook state, even though in America, I think it's much larger, just in absolute and even proportional terms. I mean, we're talking millions of people affiliated with it. It's a parasite. It's a cancer.
It's it's in the East. It's more visceral. Like when I was in Kazakhstan, I mean, you can see it, and it's in your face. You know, when one night we get a knock on the door, and it's a Kazakh, one guy, authority, cop, or whatever, and he just walks right into my kitchen apartment there in Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. Nice guy, but you know, he's filling out the forms, and he's just making sure, you know, we were registered, that we were living in that apartment, and they needed to see that we were living in that apartment. And that is just, when you think about it, that's just wild that like a government agent goes to your home to make sure you're. And then I experienced, you know, Kazakh government flipping on and off the internet. I had to go through 3 VPNs. My private email, Start Mail, is banned in Kazakhstan and Russia. So it's like I had to use the VPNs to get to my email, and then they blocked my VPNs, which I can't, then get to my email. So all that sort of stuff. But then to get back to Strelkov and then the Ukraine war, what would be the further meaning of this? I mean, it's kind of, you're explaining Russia is doing the same to their true dissidents and patriots as the West does, as China does, as Europe does, right? Alina Lipp, the German journalist, they cut off her bank accounts, her parents' bank accounts. Graham Phillips in the UK. I mean, we can go on and on with all these different stories all over the place here in Mexico.
Well, my Russian bank account is cut off as well. Why? Because I got kicked out of Russia, and I need a Russian SIM card to get the notifications to access the app, and I can't get it fixed at all. I can't communicate. I can't get through to these people. I have to figure out a way. So like, I know it's like I'm being facetious here, but people have a lot of problems with the spare bank, and we're going to bring up spare bank as well. Just the way everything is structured in the Slavlands, it's so anti-people. It's so pro-corporation, where these people can just straight up steal your money temporarily. Like there have been moments when they've frozen people's accounts. Oh, we're just doing like a check, a maintenance check, frozen. They didn't have the money, so they froze the accounts. They moved some stuff over. Sberbank posts record profits. Sberbank owns almost all of Russia. None of this ever gets mentioned. But I'm jumping ahead. Let's talk about Strelkov. If you're
just to add on that story as well. I was going to open up. I still have a Kazakh bank account, and I was going to open a stock account there. But then, given what you're saying now, I was like, well, I'm moving. I'm not going to live in Kazakhstan forever. We moved back to Mexico, and it's like, I'm at some point, I'm not going to have the access to my bank account. Something like what you explained is going to happen, or they're going to do another COVID, and then I won't be able to get on a plane without being injected to go check my account in Kazakhstan. And so I just thought, to heck with it. But and the bigger picture of the Ukraine war. So Strelkov. What is important there with him? Are there others like him? And then to get your thoughts on where are we with the Ukraine war?
Yeah, well, look, there's, in any situation, any country, there's a small group of people that more or less are telling the truth. Like there's just people who are truth inclined, truth oriented, who will do their best with their limitations to try and give you a different perspective, which is probably more closely aligned with the truth. We have these people in America, we have them in the West, we have them in any country. You'll have a handful of these types. There are Ukrainians who will say interesting things about what's happening in Ukraine, and there are Russians who will say interesting things about this whole situation, about their government. For example, Arestovych, who is he's an interesting character. He was the former advisor to President Zelensky, and before that he was a Duginite, and his whole background is frankly bizarre. He's got a spook background. You have to be a spook to be anybody. Strelkov is also a former spook, a reserve spook. It's like the new nobility. If you're talking about Europe of the 15th or the before that, or the 16th century, you're talking about different nobles, right? And in the modern times, we're talking about different spooks. Someone says they like Tucker. I'm like, yeah, well, he's a spook too. His father was a spook. He's a spook royalty. And someone says, oh, I don't like this what's his name, Anderson Cooper on CNN. Well, he's another spook as well. So we're just discussing different.
We can go further. I mean, even Alex Jones, his whole entire family, Andrew Tate. It's just mind-boggling.
Andrew Tate, great example. Yeah, great example. Like, you wouldn't think some weird pimp in Romania or whatever would, but yeah, he's affiliated. He's a CIA family or OSS at the time. Anyway, yeah, it's incredible. So when we're talking about all these personalities, we're talking about the nobility. And sure, you can pick one noble or the other who you think represents your interests better. And I'm pro Strelkov, but I mean, he is a spook. Like, I'm not a spook. I'm not affiliated with intelligence, and so to me, that's always going to be like a barrier. And I think that's an important thing to understand, like who we're talking about here. These aren't, despite what even if I might agree with someone with say what Tucker has to say, we're not the same people. We're not in the same caste. There's always going to be that where you have to wonder what their true allegiance is and whether this influences their behavior. So with Strelkov, there are other people like him. He's just the most visible, the most prominent. Arestovych, who was the Ukrainian advisor to President Zelensky, who is now hiding out in America because he fears assassination in Ukraine. He also says interesting things about the war. Like, he admits that actually Ukraine, Kiev, got everything that they wanted out of the negotiations for the ceasefire that occurred in April, a couple months after the start of the SMO. So that was in the first year. And he says, we opened a champagne bottle. Everything we wanted, we got out of it. We were actually really pleased by the terms that Moscow offered us. And we were a bit surprised that Zelensky then tore up the agreement, the peace with Russia. And these kinds of statements are very interesting because they piss everybody off. Everybody who hears this gets extremely offended. It's the same thing with a lot of these truth tellers. You'll figure it out. Like, partisans will say something that at least appeals to one large group of people. But let's think about what Arestovych is saying when he says this. He's saying that Moscow surrendered, essentially. Like, Moscow sold out, that Moscow gave Kiev everything they wanted. The Nazis, the satanic globalist Nazis that we're fighting a holy jihad against right now. Yeah, apparently, according to Arestovych and this other guy, some other people have come out, and according to Lukashenko, who also operates it, Moscow was willing to surrender Donbass and was willing to start leasing Crimea from Ukraine, from Kiev again. And so anyone who's like pro-Russia is not going to like that news, and no one's going to touch it because it says something about Putin and his cronies that they basically sold out. They were like, yeah, here, have all this stuff, right? And then nobody on Ukraine's side is going to touch the story as well, because Arestovych is saying, well, there was no reason for this war. Moscow is basically our greatest ally. They gave us more than we wanted, and we still decided to fight a war. And it means that they're lying about how, like, this is this amazing war of liberation and self-defense. Is nothing of the kind. They were never at any risk. And that's the same thing with Strelkov and his stuff. He'll explain certain realities from the front. He'll explain certain political realities. Like, he'll often say Putin was probably a Western asset, a Western intelligence asset, who probably got turned during his service in Germany. And he'll point out that a lot of the original 90s government in Russia were people who, for some reason or another, were stationed in Europe, in, like, what do you call it? In Eastern Europe, in, like, bordering Western Europe, basically. A lot of people that for some reason had ties with the West, for one reason or the other. For one, maybe it's part of their job or whatever. It doesn't matter. You look at the list of personalities in the Kremlin, and it's like, yeah, wow, that guy was the liaison with this Western country, and this guy was stationed in this Western country. Interesting. What a coincidence. So he was, and so, but let's take let's apply the same filter, the same analysis to the statement that Putin may have been, in the beginning of his career, a Western asset or a Western chosen replacement for Yeltsin. Who would like to hear that? Do the Russians like to hear? Well, a lot of them do, but, like, would the average Russian who's patriotically inclined like to hear that his commander in chief was an agent of the enemy sent in as part of an occupation government to deliberately weaken Russia? No, of course not. No one wants to hear that. Does the average Ukrainian want to hear that, in that case, their struggle for, against everything bad and for everything good rings hollow, because the guy that they're struggling against is actually an agent of the people who are funding them and giving them weapons. So you see, these kinds of explanations, they add a little bit of complication to the simple emotional propaganda narratives that we're supposed to be consuming. So, anytime you add a little bit of nuance, the propaganda aspect is diminished, and so there's basically a war on nuance in the commentator sphere. You can't ever mention any of these details. You can't mention what Strelkov said, what Arestovych said, because these people kind of throw a wrench into the wheel, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and we even see that in the alternative media space, where now like the alternative media is becoming like mainstream alternative media, where they're starting to look and feel like legacy media, and they're losing this nuance. They're no longer like you and I. They're not going there. And one thing I wanted to ask you before was, we've seen Lavrov or Putin, I think, make these declarations like the satanic West with their transgenderism and all this sort of stuff. So how is it that, they have this appearance that they are battling the West, but I would agree with you that they really are not. They're implementing the technocracy and all of that, but
well, even on the gay thing, that's like also just not true that Russia's like anti-gay. If you look a little bit deeper into it, you'll find that there's this politician. His name is Milanov. He's from St. Petersburg, and he was featured in this documentary by Steve Fry, who is this prominent homosexual who came over to Russia to basically berate them for being anti-gay. But a lot of these anti-gay initiatives were citizen-driven. They were grassroots, or they were politicians on he's a populist, this Milanov. It was populist, sort of Christian or nationalists or like monarchist type politicians who forced the issue. I mean, this guy was hammering away at it for a decade. They tried to create groups. They tried to create initiatives. It was a very and it proved very popular. And so the Kremlin belatedly, the Kremlin wasn't talking like this in 2006. They weren't talking like this in 2011. They picked it up like, a shopper would in an aisle at the shopping market, at the grocery store. They were like looking around. All right, we need something to make this propaganda recipe. Okay, ooh, cinnamon. Let's take that. Let's add this to it. Putin recently, just this year, said gays actually belong in the media. They contribute a lot to it, and they should be able to celebrate their gay culture in Russian media. And this man is portrayed as like the Mr. Anti-gay. Pence in America is probably more anti-gay than Putin, with his like electro-shocking therapy approach to the problem. I don't know if he still believes that or if he dumped that, but I'm talking about Putin has never been this Mr. Anti-gay guy. And a lot of the stuff that people misattribute to Putin is actually attributable to the regular Russian people and smaller populist politicians who have been working tirelessly to try and combat the gay thing. And on another level, then the gays control a lot of institutions in Russia. And I don't know. I mean, like, you could say on some level that it's a lifestyle choice, and who are we to judge? But on another level, it's just observable behavior that homosexuals band together and create networks of influence and support for one another. And this is just a phenomenon that repeats over and over again. You can even read what the old Stalinist communists were writing about them, and they said the same thing. They initially they weren't even against gays because the Soviet Union was a very progressivist, revolutionary, libertine project in its initial conception. They just found that these networks were being subversive and they couldn't compete with these people. So what happened in Russia in the late 80s and the 90s is that these mafias started operating again. So famously, the Moscow police was run by homosexual mafia. And you'll have like a lot of dissident or like sort of critiques of the police from the 90s and depictions of them. And they're depicted as depraved homosexual sadistic predators who sodomize brutally prisoners and stuff. Like, this is and so and then when we talk about the media in Russia, it's run by the Velvet Mafia as well, or the Lavender Mafia. I forget what it's called, but you look at them and you can see it used to be that they could be open about it. Like, it never used to be a thing that they had to sort of conceal it. So a lot of people that used to be open about it back in the day are now pretending that they're straight because it's fashionable now. You know, Russia's apparently cracking down on gay propaganda, but they all keep their positions. One of them runs the Orthodox network, SPAS. The guy who runs the Orthodox network is a homosexual man who used to be more open about it, and then he got his job as head of a Christian media organization, the only one in Russia, and now he kind of plays it on the down low. There's many examples of it, like the guy who was put in charge of conservative media in Russia to create a conservative platform, ideology, a project. I think Krasnov is his name, and I mean, he was an open homosexual as well. And this is Mr. Conservative. This is the guy who is finding conservative, pro-Russian writers that he can get together and create Krasovsky, sorry, and to get together and to create like an anti-Western opposition to. I mean, this is ridiculous. You look at the entertainment media, and it's open homosexuals. I mean, men in drag. Russia has men in drag who perform, and the grannies love it. You know, they never, you know what I mean? It's like, and I'm not saying this to say that I'm pro-Ukraine. Ukraine has all of this and worse. You know, it's the same thing. These are basically the same countries that went through the same thing. The elite have the same mindset. It's remarkably similar. Like you said, it's like two rival gangs. And the thing is that they weren't even rival gangs in the past. And a lot of, for example, Russian media was created and filmed in Ukraine. Why? Because it was cheaper. So almost all of the Russian, in fact, they still continue filming there. Some of them. That's a funny story. Russian media, like soap operas and dramas and these shows, most of them are filmed in Ukraine still to this day. And how do you square that circle? There's a war apparently an existential war against Nazism, and yet Russia continues to sell them gas, continues to sell them tomatoes.
Well, and I think until recently, uranium. I heard that was it like a month ago? The U.S. finally said we're not going to purchase uranium anymore from Russia. But then to get like really to the crux of the issue, what does the Western camp want? You know, Washington, London, Brussels, and then you've got the other. I don't know even if there is a unified collective East, but you know, it seems like the U.S. wants to destroy Russia or subjugate it. It seems like Russia wants to sort of just be seen as equals at the same globalist table. That's sort of the best latest conclusion that I've come to. They're all just jostling for position at the same globalist table, but it seems like the West wants to take over like an octopus Russia, and Russia would be happy just, you know, being equal partners. You know, any thoughts as to what Washington wants to do with Russia and then what Kremlin?
You know, there's layers to it. Like, I can't tell you about the specific business interests because that's going to be a big factor. Like, it's who gets what. You know, how much of this plant and how much of this country do you own? I don't know the details of that. That's hashed out behind the scenes. That's probably 90% of what the peace agreement between Kiev and Moscow was in Istanbul, right? Which oligarch gets what? This whole operation was launched pretty much exactly because Putin's godfather, oligarch friend, Medvedchuk, was arrested and his network was being wrapped up. That's pretty much it. It was an oligarch rescue operation, and it's clear that he was supposed to be included in the peace deal. Anyway, but the point of it is that there's that aspect, and then there might be an ideological aspect. So the ideological conflict between the East and the West, which was only partially resolved with the collapse of the Soviet Union, might linger on to this day. And so you basically have the differences between the main difference during the Cold War was between Trotskyites and Stalinists, right? And then the Trotskyite faction within the USSR took power, Gorbachev, and before that Andropov. and they instituted these reforms, and they basically blew the whole thing up. And the reason why was they wanted convergence. They wanted to join the elite. Now, they were trying to do this by smoothing over ideological discrepancies between the East and the West. It's hard for Westerners to conceptualize of this, but their government and their whole ideology is Trotskyism. Like, if I were to take a politician from 2004 and 2003 and replay some of their statements, it would come off as like, hard right-wing reactionary. We're talking about people who don't accept gay marriage. We're talking about people who are willing to maybe talk about crime and immigration, even on the Democrat side. Like, it's incredible. If we look at the tapes of Biden in the 90s, right? He's willing to talk about how desegregation and busing is like a problem, and people will replay these clips, and even Kamala Harris is willing to talk about super predators, and it's hard to conceptualize of America at the time as being Trotskyite, but it was at the elite level. It's the neocons are sort of like the Israel-oriented part of that. But so you have a difference still ideologically between East and the West, and a lot of it was bridged when the pro-Western faction came to power in the Soviet Union, and they collapsed the wall, and they sort of began integrating into this globalist system. But it seems clear to me that there's still some ideological divergence between the two. And this ideological divergence is basically like Western versus Eastern communism. And there are elements, I think, of the old communist idea that a lot of these the people who are running Russia are like in their 80s and their 90s, that these old Soviet dinosaurs, they still cling to that. So, for example, Finkelstein, the guy who was the top spook in Russia at the time, who tapped Putin. There was a meeting between Putin, Kissinger, and Yeltsin, and that's when Putin was tapped to be the successor. And so Finkelstein is sort of the Russian Kissinger counterpart. And it seems like, he was a very old school, like pioneer, Soviet youth type guy. And it seems that some of his views are decidedly old school, and there are a lot of people who are from his age cohort who still kind of cling to these older ideas. That might be one of the friction points between East and the West. So it's not as stark as between a Stalinist and a Trotskyist, like these two different forms of communism. It might be two different forms of globalism. It's just a little bit of, and I've gotten into some of the ideological differences a little bit on the blog, and I'm going to write about it more in the future. But again, if we keep in mind the tyranny of small differences, it may seem inconsequential. You guys are for world government, we're for world government. You're for destroying culture and creating a global mass of gray, standardized, serialized, people, citizens, comrades, proletariat, or whatever. We're for the same thing, except we call them consumers. It might seem like it's very superficial, but I think it's worth pointing out that this might be one of the cornerstones of the conflict.
Yeah.
And then finally, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I saw sometimes when I talk about AMLO, Lopez Obrador, the president of Mexico, kind of like as you analyze things, if you look on paper, he's a globalist, because he's actually come out and said, let's copy the EU and integrate Canada, USA, Mexico into North American Union. So de facto globalist, there's a tweet from 2016 with him and Jeremy Corbyn, where he says, he openly says literally something. He says world government, like we want world government. But his term here, he has done good things. Like he's worked to retain the energy sovereignty, or the sovereignty in different forms here in Mexico, energy sovereignty, food sovereignty. So I would kind of use him as an example of, let's say, maybe a little more humane sort of globalist versus some of these other guys who want to just destroy and pillage everything.
Yeah, for sure. Like, for example, how about this one? Was there really, looking back at it, a difference between Bush and Kerry? Like, would it really have made a difference if Kerry had won instead of Bush in the?
I doubt it. But both were skull and bones, right?
Yeah, good point. It's all one elite limited hangout, and we're not part of it. It's like that. Who was that comedian?
George Carlin.
Yeah. It's one big club and you're not in it. So it's the same thing. And you look at, there's this saying that like you can judge a person by the 5 closest people around them. And you look at the 5 closest people around Putin, and it's like, wow, these are very like Medvedev. He's pretending to be this caricature of an ultra patriot, but when he first showed up on the scene, this is the ultra liberal reformer guy. This is the Justin Trudeau of Russia. Hey kids, I like the rock music too. Hey, look, I had a perm in the 80s. I'm one of you. Like that was his whole thing. And then you go down I'm not saying that he's close to Putin now, but you go down the list of all the people that have been around Putin, that have mentored Putin, that Putin used to work for. Sobchak, for example, Anatoly Sobchak from St. Petersburg. We know that this guy stole gargantuan amounts of money from St. Petersburg and stuffed it in Paris. He was a criminal. He was a gangster. People died. And Putin was part of his team. He was walking around like a gopnik in his sort of like Italian mobster style velvet Adidas pants. Like all he was missing is the golden chain and one of those hats, like those like pikey sort of, what do you call them, Irish type berets. That's all he was missing to complete the look. So we know that this is what his early career was like. We know that he was involved in some sort of hoodlum street activity because he was part of a criminal judo gang when he was young and in St. Petersburg. And 2 of the guys who were in the judo gang with him are 2 of Russia's most powerful oligarchs now. His master, his sensei, was a criminal, like an organized mafia criminal, part of the organized Jewish mafia in Russia. You go down the list, okay, Medvedchuk, this guy who's now the godfather to Putin's daughter, or the other way around, I always forget. Basically, adopted family at this point, close friend of Putin. What do we know about this guy? He's a criminal. He's an oligarch. He's blood on his hands, stolen, misappropriated, expropriated. This is a very shady guy, close to Putin. And the funny thing is that he's out there, and the statements he makes are very similar to what Strelkov would say. It's like in America, for example, you're not allowed to talk about the Great Replacement. But you are actually, if you're a liberal. So you're allowed to say, I hate white people. I hate white men. I hate Christian, straight, heterosexual white men. And it's a good thing that they're going to be a minority in the next 10 years, right? And that's okay. That's A-okay. That's love speech. But if you say, oh my God, white Christian men are being targeted and the country's being forcibly diversified and they're trying to get rid of whites and make them a minority in America, well, then you're a hate speech, whatever, like in trouble with the feds. You're in that kind of a situation, right? You're a bad person. It's the same thing. So Strelkov says, look, Moscow is looking to make a deal with the West. Moscow's elites are dependent on the West. Their whole worldview is Western. Their capital networks are Western. Their assets are stashed in the West. Every single one of them has assets stashed in the West that we know of, right? Lavrov, for example, Mr. I'm going to geopolitically checkmate the West. He had of that we know of, it was revealed that he had an 11 million pound flat and a daughter living in London while the SMO was going on. Never did he feel that he had to save her from the Satanists, Never did he feel that her life was in trouble. No, she's living in her, in her bachelor pad. You go down the list, Peskov, the top spokesman for the Kremlin, his son got in trouble because he was part of some packy drug dealing gang that got pulled over by the police in London. I don't know if it was London, in the UK as well. But so he got in trouble for that. And we can see pictures. We can see how he looks, how he behaves like. This man is like a wannabe Eminem.
This reminds me of, and there's a trend here because it's interesting that they're all in the UK. When I was in Kazakhstan, like the last year or two that I was there was a story that broke that Nursultan Nazarbayev, right, 30 years president, that technically I was employed by Nazarbayev, but there was a story that his son, I think, or his grandson who was living in UK. And it's all the same scenario as you paint. They're all posh. They all got all this money that they took from the people of their countries, right? And he did something crazy out there in the UK, and then it's just the same story over and over. And it's funny why they're all concentrated in the UK. People, I've had guests on that say some of the core center of globalist power might be the old British Empire.
Golkowski. He claims that that it's still the city of London.
Yeah, and I didn't want to ask you. You mentioned Spearbank and Herman Graf and our friend Riley Wagaman. He just this morning published something on these spare smart cities that Graf is now rolling out, these 15-minute cities. And this is the thing. I actually live in one. So I'm here in Mexico, and I live in a resilient city, which is it's a Rockefeller financed smart city. So here in Mexico, Russia's building them out in Russia. It's like, everywhere in Kazakhstan. And so just your thoughts on Herman Graf and Sparebank.
Well, yeah, it's the 15-minute, RT ran with an article last year, I mean, and the article said, actually, the Soviet Union had 15-minute cities, that this is a Soviet idea. And they were like saying, they were trying to spin it as if saying, like, actually, we're the real progressivists. And it's like, this is communism. This is the different flavor of communism that we're talking about. But it's the same thing. We're trying to create a global USSR, but it's not going to probably have, like, the commie blocks are going to be made out of plastic, not just beton, not just concrete. They're going to look a little bit different architecturally. Maybe they'll have like an orange stripe running across them, like a racing stripe, to make them more aesthetic or something. But yeah, it's going to be these mega blocks, 15-minute cities. You have 15-minute cities in Russia. It's these micro rayone, and I've lived in them. You have everything you need. There's not necessarily anything bad about having something within 15-minute walking range from you. The point is that, like, it's just yes, these ideas have been around for a while. They want to create these giant mega block areas. And the reason why they want to do it is because they want control. They legitimately want to be able to shut areas down. They want areas to be like on the grid, in the sense that, like, you can flip a switch and one section of the city goes dark and the other one loses its water. It's like a way of, they want to make sure that people can't organize. So they want to make sure that there's this sense of ennui, of like not knowing your neighbors, or knowing your neighbors and keeping away from them because you know that they're pieces of shit, and there's no way for you to self-segregate. There's no way for good people, well-meaning, mannered, genteel people to self-segregate and create, because that's usually what people do. Like, if you're slightly smarter and slightly more industrious and disciplined, you don't want to live with slobs, and so you will try to move out. You'll try to go to a slightly better area, and you'll find that there are also people who are slightly better, more cultured, that live in this area. In general, this is what humans have always done. They've self-segregated. But the idea of these 15-minute cities is to make it difficult for people to create conscious communities. At least that's part of it. And so it's not difficult to, anyway, with the Sparebank stuff, Sparebank is pretty much, Russia has these interesting corporations that are, I guess, if you use the 70s term, I guess, I can't actually call it that because it's illegal, but it starts with the letter F. And the idea is that it's a merger between the government and the state, the government and the private sector, where the line becomes totally blurred. But again, this is just sort of communism, but with a different flavor, because the tail is wagging the dog. So in the Soviet Union, you would have these agencies and these bureaucrats who would own massive factories, and they would like answer for, say, the canned meat supply or whatever. And then the sort of the polarity has switched, and now it's the head of the corporation or head of the industry, or a big economic boss man who is in a relationship in the same way with the government, but he's sort of the one that calls the shots. So it's flipped. So it's similar, but it's just there's more of an emphasis on the people with the money call the shots, as opposed to the people with the government office call the shots. And it's the same thing with Sberbank. If it was like a Soviet type situation, then Hermann Gref would be subordinate to some bureaucrat in the Russian government, subordinate to Putin. But as the situation is in Russia, there's still this synthesis of state and private sector. It's just, the private sector people have more say. They're more powerful in this relationship. So it's actually Hermann Gref who creates state policy in Russia, not the other way around. So he gets to decide where state resources will be allocated. Why? Because he owns all the capital in Russia. So if he wants something to be funded, if he wants certain things to be built, certain projects to be invested into, he allocates money to them. In the Soviet system, the government would have to do that, and then they would use these various institutions to get it done. So you see, it's been flipped. And who's Hermann Gref? Well, he's just a private individual. He can do whatever he wants. There's no limits or restraints put on his behavior. And Putin will be the first to say it. He can do whatever he wants, and he can do as he sees fit. And what that means is that foreign interests or cabals and like religious groups and transhumanist groups and people with bizarre ideologies who follow strange religions, and he's a Kabbalist, right? These people are free to influence him because, hey, he's a private individual. I'm into meditation. Some other person's into bike riding. Hermann Gref's into Kabbalah. It's the same thing. Who cares? You can't tell him what to do. And so he will fund all this bizarre stuff, facial recognition technology. He will encourage schools to have like airport-style security checks run by Sberbank. The teachers are trained by Sberbank. There's Sberbank trained teachers.
A lot of that stuff seeped in, like even to Kazakhstan, the technocracy. I was trying to escape when COVID hit from Kazakhstan because I knew it was all just an operation, and it took me like 3 attempts to escape with my family, and eventually it took like 5 days to get back to Mexico. But because I was afraid that I'd be stuck forever in Kazakhstan that I wouldn't be able to board a plane without being injected. And even people told me later that at the school in Kazakhstan during COVID, you'd have to they added like iPads or screens to scan your face, like if you were wearing the mask or to check who you were, and if something was off, you couldn't pass the turnstile, and then people couldn't. It was very hardcore. We were issued during COVID the cards which said you couldn't leave the apartment at all one day, and they had like police on patrol. It was absolutely like I was living in some bizarro world, dystopia. And that's being rolled out in Russia. I keep reading on Biometric Update every week. Russia's rolling out massive facial recognition, all this crazy stuff. Do you personally think, like looking globally, do you think we're on the road to dystopia, that we're going to end up in this sort of global social credit type system, or are you sort of more optimistic that they won't be able to implement it?
Well, we kind of have to understand that we live in yesteryear's dystopia. So if you read H.G. Wells, or if you read, I don't know, like even Orwell, I guess, even though Orwell was a Trotskyite, and that's the only reason why Westerners were encouraged to read his books in high school, it wasn't because their government was anti-totalitarian, it's their government was anti-Stalinist. And the books were pro-Trotsky propaganda. And all these people who have Orwell quotes in their bio, I'm sorry, but you're basically like Boxer from Animal Farm, or you're like the gullible masses. You didn't bother to look more deeply into this. You never asked the question, why did the government that is oppressing me encourage me to read a book about totalitarianism and something? I mean, isn't that kind of weird? So yes, our current reality, if someone from 1950 or 1960 was plucked out of their timeline and dropped into our world now, they think that we were in a dystopia already. And if you did, and we've, you read all the social engineering literature that's come out in the last 100 years and the last 200 years, you can even start with Plato, and you could be like, oh, wow, a lot of these things have already been implemented. And we've already been changed. Our whole worldview has been, the new norm now is so crazy. And then you could say that 2012, some people write about this, is like, was already like a Maoist cultural revolution that we lived through. Like the last 10 plus years have been a nonstop rolling cultural revolution. You look at the way in the last decade or so that views about transgenderism, sexual identity, sexual practice, dating practice, marriage, family formation, the role of the state, just all this stuff of social relations among people. It used to be, prior to 2012, you could be friends with someone that voted for an opposing political party. You can't do that now in this new age where everything has become so dramatically politicized. So we already live in a dystopia. We live in yesteryear's dystopia. And when they, and yeah, of course they'll, why would, like, the only thing that could prevent them rolling this out is like some sort of technological mishap, or like they just don't have the tech yet, or if a solar flare occurred. There's no organized political force that's pushing back against any of this stuff. Why would they not succeed in this? If I can prove that all these things are happening in China, in Russia, in Ukraine, in America, everywhere, where is the locus of resistance to it? And what would be the ideological resistance to it? Like, if you take the ideas of, say, liberalism from the 19th or the 18th century, you can see that, like, you know, logically, a lot of the stuff that's happened is consistent with this ideology. You know, even you take communism and you're like, okay, well, what's happening now is pretty consistent with communism. There's no real contradiction. I can't really argue from, if everybody accepts some of the key tenets of communism, that we're all equal, you know, that this is the role of the government, and that you just go down the list. Most people accept many of the key core tenets of communism. Just like just like nowadays, following the cultural revolution of the last decade, most people accept the core tenets of SJWism. So the only thing that most people have any problem with is that things are going too fast, I guess. The amount of people who have a principled idea, like worldview that they've formed out, that's fully fleshed out, that they can sort of say, okay, this is why I'm in principle against all this stuff. We're talking, you know, single-digit % of people. Most people are on board, I would say, with all this. I mean, you talk to the average person, and they're like, oh yeah, it's going to be convenient, technology's good, I believe in all this stuff I'm supposed to believe in, at least in the cities. I don't know if that's been your experience.
We have the same view. Like I've been talking about, like, here in Mexico, it's just, you look around me, it's all bots. It's like, you know, I don't like going to the big box stores. If I have to, like, I haven't been to Costco in years. Like, I'll go once and I'll buy up like stuff, non-perishables, for 3 years, literally. But then I just see everyone around. They're all into the Netflix, Amazon boxes strewn across the streets. They're all, you know, McDonald's, Walmart, all that stuff. And I feel like you. I kind of have this view that there's nothing is stopping the global algorithm ghetto, as I like to call it. It's rolling forward. And I was going to mention this tweet from Shi Van Fleet. She's this Chinese, an American. She put out a book, and she got this tweet. I think it relates to what you're saying. She says, mandatory vaccines and DEI training are the equivalent of Mao's let 100s of flowers bloom campaign in the 50s. Both were designed to identify and weed out resistance. So I think she hit it on the head. Like, that's right now underway. Active measures, as my recent podcast guest J. Michael Waller would say, former CIA dude. And I want to get back to the multipolarity thing. We were talking about media, and something interesting I've found. Who was it? I had a guest on recently, Keith Preston of AttackTheSystem.com on my TNT show, and he said that it can be argued that BRICS is nothing more than the eastern wing of the global system, perhaps controlled opposition, or at best rebellious provinces within the global system. He says, I do think BRICS are trying to become more assertive within the global system. I think they really are in conflict with the US and Europe. The idea, though, that they are counter-globalist is something we will have to wait to see. He concludes, he says, I've always said the Duginists, the Eurasianists, are really just counter-imperialists. They're not anti-globalists. They're not anti-imperialists. They're more like counter-globalists, counter-imperialists, since they want an imperialism or globalism of their own, a globalism where they are the hegemonic force rather than the U.S. and Europe. And then, any thoughts you have on Dugin and multipolarity and whatnot. But I've noticed something funny in the alternative media and social media, that the multipolar Twitter accounts and Telegram accounts seem to be, and other such accounts, YouTube's, whatever, I feel like they're being artificially boosted, which is weird. I don't know if you've noticed that. I've had, like, on Telegram, the Geopolitics live channel reach out to me, trying to get me to, like, cross post and work with them, and I'm kind of like, I think, Dimitri is his name, or something. And he does have it's a good show, but it's really got that one really ideology. And I don't want to be affiliated with anyone. I want to be, like, independent, because I don't want to work with Geopolitics Live and then get boosted because now I'm, like, affiliated with the Russian camp. And I'm like, no, I'm my own. I'm not a number, as Patrick McGuckin would say. But have you noticed this artificial boost by the whole BRICS multipolarity fan people online?
Yeah, but Dugin is not like a real thing. I mean, it's just, I've talked about this a lot, and it's like nobody knew who he was before his daughter was assassinated in Russia. I doubt many people knew who he was. It's what he's talking about is incoherent. I can't make any sense out of it. Okay, I'm not an idiot. I got a perfect score on my verbal, on my written portion of my SAT. I think I can understand text that's written out. I think I can understand ideas. I think I can understand speech. I can't make any sense out of what this guy is talking about. It's total incoherence. Now, there is a difference between metaphysics Dugin and geopolitics Dugin, and I'm gonna focus on the geopolitics Dugin. It makes no. I mean, he wrote, one of the best ways is to check someone's opinion on a topic that you're well versed in. So, for example, Dugin wrote about Texas recently, and it was just like total incoherent trite. And I know enough about America to know that this man has no clue what he's talking about. When he's talking about America, he's talking about this rebellion, about all over the top zany stuff about how this is the beginning of the end, and how this will the land-based anti whatever globalist forces are rising up. It's total incoherence, and he has no rank in Russia. He does not have. He has no position. Okay, his channel is small in Russia. Nobody understands. He's a meme. Like, nobody understands what he's talking about because he sort of just speaks in this way. And I think he does it partially intentionally to be obscure, because he's very afraid of the state. He used to be extremely anti-Kremlin. We're talking about, he was part of the Nazbol party. The Nazbols are basically a party that takes the Nazi flag, and they substitute the swastika for the hammer and the sickle, but they keep the aesthetic. And so his whole thing, and he was with Limonov, who I referenced before, who is this political radical. So they created this very vehemently anti-Kremlin activist party. And he was very anti-Christian as well. His videos of him engaging in, what a Christian would call satanic rituals, with like men on crosses being spun, and like cavorting naked people, and chalices, and recitation of strange poetry. So he was like really into all that edgy stuff. He was talking about UFOs and vampires on TV in the 90s. And now he's rebranded as like a Dostoevsky type figure. He's like, everyone thinks he's like this super monarchist, orthodox, traditionalist guy. And it's just because he has a white beard, and because he speaks with a Russian accent, and because there's nobody else. What is he talking about when he's talking about Eurasianism? He's talking about, as coherently as I can try and make of it, he's saying that the Russians share a soul on a spiritual level with like some of these Turkic peoples because of the steppe. And he's using Spengler. Spengler was this guy who talked about the souls of collective nations. And so he said there's a Teutonic soul, like a German soul, the Faustian soul, as he called it. There's the Magian soul, which is like the southern Maghrebi Arabic soul. There's the Apollonian soul, which is the southern European soul. There's the Slavic soul. And so Dugin is saying that the Slavic soul is characterized, it's very similar to the Turkic soul because it's characterized by the steppe. It's characterized by expansiveness, by destruction, by the forces of chaos and fire. And so he's saying that it's like a destructive engine that can remake the world in like a bloody type conflagration. And I mean, you really get into this stuff, and it's like it's hard to understand when he's talking about geopolitics, when he's talking about politicians, and when he's talking about spiritual forces at work in the world. And I defy anybody who's actually read Fourth Political Theory like I have to try and make any sense out of it. I think this is a red herring. I think the multipolar BRICS thing is happening, and the Dugin people are just trying to be relevant by hitching their horse to that and saying, "Oh yeah, that's sort of what we're talking about as well." I don't know what they're talking about other than just like creating a great land empire that will oppose the sea powers of the world. So there will be this like totalitarian, sort of rigid empire with traditional magical values that will be against the mercantile Athenian sea-based spirit of London and the United States or whatever. And the United States is at war between the sea-based soul of the coastal regions and the landlocked soul. You see what I'm talking about? Like, this is not what politicians are reading. This is not what the people at the BRICS forums are quoting. This is a misnomer, a red herring. And another thing that Dugin gets accused of, or he's just a lot of people, for good or bad, they seem to think that he's like a communist or something like that. And Dugin was good friends on like a first name basis with many prominent Nazis and fascists in Europe. And I'm not using this as like a slur. I'm just saying that he was friends with de Grelle, who was part of Unit Charlemagne, which was this volunteer force that went into Russia during World War II. And de Grelle liked Slavs. He was very pro-Slavic. But that's the kind of connections this guy has. He's connected with Benoit and the French people, and the what do you call it? The Grèce, the sort of the French new right. His whole idea is like to merge communism and elements of Nazism and elements of orthodoxy. It's like a total mishmash potpourri. And his main idea is that like we have to be opposed to the sort of materialist, mercantilist, sea-based powers. Like, that's it. But in terms of his actual relevance and his ability to comment accurately on current events, man, it's you should definitely look elsewhere.
He recently tweeted that America needs a civil war, and I'm like, that would play into the globalists want America to have a civil war. So, Mr. Dugin, why are you saying we need one? We need to try and avoid one. But I haven't read his books. I've read some of his stuff. Some of it. My position on Dugin has always, I don't know enough, but I think he makes you think. But I see what you're saying, that sometimes is contradictory. I don't know what he's really trying to say. I've been
like, for example, he calls for a new establishment of an order of like occultist, KGB, monarchist, orthodox types. Like, that's his latest book, or the reprinting of his latest that just came out. And that's his thing. He wants to create a Templar-based secret society of spooks. It's like, bro, like they're way ahead of you on that. Like, they don't need you telling them that, because that's what they do. Like, they are occultists.
Yeah,
they are a secret society.
They are. I mean, I've mentioned this before. When I was in Geneva, I visited the Lucis Trust, originally founded as Lucifer Publishing in 1922. And they believe Lucifer is the Christ, and that they say that this Lucifer figure is here now. They're preparing for his return. And this is a official United Nations affiliated NGO, and I went to one of their meetings, and so just so people, no one can call me conspiracy theorist. I've got the document. I've actually got it somewhere here in a box where it says, it talks about Prometheus and Lucifer. But just on Dugin's, I've been meaning to purchase the physical copies of his books and then try to get him on. He does follow the Geopolitics and Empire Twitter account, so he does follow me there. So I'll see if eventually I can talk to him. But you mentioned BRICS. What's your, you and I both know Yuri Roshka's view on BRICS, and I've had other people like on the podcast, Professor William I. Robinson, and he's a leftist professor in California, but he says that it's a sham. The term was coined by a WEF Young Global Leader together with Goldman Sachs. And then, people like William I. Robinson from the left says that if you look at it like technically, BRICS it's still part of the one global capitalist system. It's not like some alternative.
Yeah. Just go down the list. Like, what are your problems with the current financial global system, right? And then ask yourself, will BRICS address these problems? A Rothschild-owned currency for every single country. Will BRICS change that? What could this thing? You go down the whole list of, is it a gold-based currency? No. Are they gonna? You're worried about, say, these crypto coins of a centralized digital currency that they can play around with the rates and make it so that they can force you to buy things because they'll give it a negative interest rate, right? Or they can artificially inflate or devalue the coin, and they'll have total control. They can choose what you're allowed to purchase or not. They can deactivate your account for wrong think or wrong speech, right? And what will BRICS? No, BRICS wants to do all that, but faster and like more in like a slight. They want to have an orange racing stripe on it, like that's the difference. And then think about the acronym itself. What do these countries have in common? What does Brazil have in common with Russia? What does India have in common with Russia? What does South Africa? South Africa is a basket case. Why are we still pretending that like it's an important player in anything? It's these people are, veering from one artificial crisis, political crisis to another. It's bizarre. Yeah. So I mean, and then another thing is that they keep saying that China is this big ally of Russia. China hasn't done anything to support Russia. China sells to both sides of this war, and it mostly abides by the sanctions that were put on Russia. Sure, there are ways that Russians have been able to smuggle in, say, like drone parts and stuff. But China has done nothing to support Russia. China has not opened up lines of credit. China has not created factories producing ammo and tanks for the Russians. China has not. They've done nothing, okay? They've not provided diplomatic support. They haven't recognized the referendum. They haven't supported Russia about the war. If anything, they're looking to reconstruct Ukraine in the aftermath by securing contracts, rebuilding contracts. So it's all just a farce. It's like, well, this doesn't really exist. Iran and Russia. Russia sided with the Gulf states against Iran's claims over a disputed water thing. There's an island that is Moscow is just a collection of oligarchs. It's a business. It's an LLC. That's it. They don't, like if China can offer them a good deal, they'll make a deal with China. And China increasingly is the same thing. That's why America invested so much into it. They created a new class in China of wealthy oligarchs who do not have any real ties to the national project of China. They send their kids to study in the West. They park their money in the West, which is partially why no one can afford real estate in Canada or in America anymore, or on the West Coast anymore, because these people just buy it all up. So their money is there. Their kids are there. Ideologically speaking, they're not, hardcore communists. I've talked to these people. I've talked to their kids. They're just consumers. They're into capitalism. They're into materialism. They're into spending, and they like Western brands. Ideologically speaking, there's no difference whatsoever between the under 40 crowd in China and the people running things in America. So it's the exact same situation as in the West. And you think that these kids of theirs, when they're sent to top schools in America and Britain and wherever, that they're not getting approached by the spooks, that they're not being turned into assets, that they're not coming back home with their heads pumped full of liberal ideology. Like I studied with Hong Kongese students, and then 10 years later, these are the people who are rioting in Hong Kong. And I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. And you look at them and they all have green hair and blue hair, and they dress like they're from the West, and they're spouting the same rhetoric as from the West. It's like, we were talking about the Russian elites. Peskov, I said his son was in the West. Solovyov, his son is a model in London, a homosexual as well. And this is Mr. Conservative TV, radio personality in Russia, talking about the war against satanic values. His son is some kind of a twink in London. You go down the list, and Putin had family living in the West that studied in like Switzerland, that had his ex-wife is married to some French oligarch, and they live in Europe as well. How many of these people had for example, Solovyov also had extensive properties in Italy. How many of these people have properties in Miami? And this is just like the stuff that we know. And then there were the Panama Papers that were leaked, and so you have to wonder. Yeah, of course, it's how can these people really be against each other when their children are literally hostages, should it come to that, in these countries, willing hostages in these countries. Their children have adopted the worldview of the supposed enemy. Their money is parked in the West. And when they do actually allow themselves to speak in Russia to the media, everything they say sounds very liberal. It sounds very globalist. It sounds very current year. And the only thing that we have that sort of argues against that is these people, these crazy bloggers, alternative, whatever.
You call them what? Xenons?
Xenon, who claim that ignore all of that. There's this secret thing going on. There's this hidden thing. They're all just faking it. It's all a trick to get the West to lower its guard. And they're actually saying the exact same thing as Western, like spook approved, mainstream approved media, because they're also portraying the Russian elites as sinister and Duginist and Nazi and whatever. Why? Because it justifies this conflict and the sanctions and whatever. And the truth of it is that no, these people are identical. It's a spat, it's a squabble. And so both CNN and the mainstream media are basically saying the same thing, that like, wow, Russia's like really serious. China's like a really serious, dastardly, scheming, Machiavellian 5D chess operator that's going to destroy the current system. Xenon says, yeah, they're going to do that, and that's a good thing. And the mainstream media says, yeah, they're going to do that, and it's a bad thing. But they're basically saying the same thing. And you can see why all of a sudden these alternative blogosphere people are getting pumped up. You can see all of a sudden why they've never had any trouble with PayPal. Mm-hmm. They've never had any trouble. Like, they make millions, these people. Where are they getting these millions from? Well, isn't it interesting that they're basically promoting the exact same narrative as the mainstream media, just from a slightly different perspective, just a slightly different flavor? If you start thinking about things that way, a lot of things start becoming clear, I think. But hey, I am a conspiracy theorist, so
yeah,
grain of salt.
So am I. And it's funny, I was shocked to discover Kim Jong-un of North Korea went to high school in Lausanne, Switzerland, just a hop skip away from where I went to grad school. And one of my classmates in Geneva was the son of Li Baodong, the China's UN, China's ambassador to the UN. And so, yeah, there's a lot of that stuff going on.
The mullahs in Iran, all Western educated, their kids all in the West, right?
It's convergence, as we started out with. Convergence, that's the name of the game. And we've covered the waterfront. This is a longer than usual podcast, but is there anything else that you think is important that you haven't brought up to mention?
Well, yeah, I mean, people like Strelkov and people who take the position of like, whoa, hold on a sec. I don't want to participate in this artificial conflict. I don't want to artificially pick a side. when it's contrived. It doesn't seem like there's any real ideological divergence here, and it seems like all of this is either like a money-making operation or an excuse for social engineering or a cull, perhaps. And these are the people who are like in the most dangerous position, because people don't like to hear this. People like to cheer for a side. People like to think that they're winning, and they will, so a lot of people will say, yeah, we're kicking these globalist Nazis butts, and it makes them happy, it makes them have hope, it justifies their laziness, because they can just sort of kick back and watch the good guys win every 2 weeks or whatever, So this whole mentality of trying to tell people, like, there's nobody going to ride in on a horse to save you, that there's not really a faction that's secretly on your side, that actually most of the elite thinks and plans the same way, and you're kind of in the crosshairs, and they think of you as a useless eater, and they're going to take measures to slowly, if it's in the West, they're going to do it in a soft way. If it's in the East, they're going to, either just in China, show up to your apartment and like throw you in a cell, or like turn off, like lock you in your apartment, like they were doing in COVID, like no food, no electricity, just lock someone in their apartment. They're going to do a lot of bad stuff to you. Or in Russia, they're going to send, or in Ukraine, they're going to send you off to the meat grinder. They're going to figure out ways to destroy your family, make it so that your women hate you, make it so that you can't have kids, make it so that your kids hate you, sterilize your kids, castrate your kids, ideologically brainwash your kids. They're going to devalue your money. They're going to make it such that you have less and less options, freedom, autonomy, strength. They're going to poison you with vaccines, bad food, vegan stuff, tofu burgers, bug pizzas. They're going to do all this stuff. They're going to take your car away from you. They're going to take your guns away from you. In most countries, they already have. They're going to make you pay more carbon taxes. They're going to regulate your breathing and your heart rate soon with the Apple Watch. They're going to send electrical shocks into your collar every time you have a bad thought. And it's like, and no one wants to hear that. They just want to outsource it. They want to say like, oh, somebody's doing something to save me. Jesus is going to like, this is all part of his plan. It's all there in Revelation. Oh, Putin, substitute for Jesus. Donald Trump, substitute for Jesus as well. And it's like, look, guys, there's only one way out of it. You have to organize. You have to find like-minded people. You have to become stronger. You have to figure out what weaknesses you have that they're targeting. Like, are you dependent on, do you have a porn addiction? Do you have a Netflix addiction? Same thing. Are you addicted to Grubhub? Are you like, on some micro level, you have to start taking measures to retake your autonomy. You have to become a stronger person. Are you dependent on the opinions of people around you? Does your wife henpeck you into keeping quiet, even though you know that what's happening is wrong? Are you afraid to speak out against literally millions of people being flooded into your country to create a global favela because you're afraid of being called the R word or the N word? It's like, we need moral courage. We need character courage. We need people with physical strength, mental strength, emotional strength. The entire system is designed to make it so that we cannot organize, we cannot cooperate with one another, that we are broken individuals, and that we are useless and completely skillless. Anyway, so the point is, I think I don't think there's much hope. I think that they're going to succeed, and it's going to become the new normal, and resistance will just be sort of, the can will be kicked down the road again. But it shouldn't change anybody's, you should still behave in a way, like, do what you can, as well as all I can say. Take measures, do what you can. I just don't believe that someone is gonna save you if you do nothing, or just believe hard enough. Like, just, you gotta active measures.
I was just gonna say that the active measures, like the movie 300, right? Even though they're facing death, just act and live as if you're going to win. Imran Khan had a tweet, which I'm forgetting now, but he said it's really the brave people are the ones fighting when they know defeat is like certain, something to that tune. But I'm not afraid. I don't think you're afraid. We're just doing what we can. Go ahead.
I know I've been talking a lot, but I would just say that the most important thing for people is to completely change the way that they think about things, because the way that we think about things limits us. It keeps us in a box, especially in the West when they use the more softer systems. Their whole system is predicated on controlling how you think. And this means that you will approach problem solving in a way that they're comfortable with. So the entire Western conception of politics is wrong. This idea of like how elections works, it's wrong. This idea that you should go out and protest, it's wrong. This idea that the media is supposed to be impartial and fair. No, it's never been that way. It's wrong. This idea, you have to really examine. You can't be like, the number one thing you have to do is change your mindset. You have to be able to think in a different way, in a non-elite approved way. You cannot think of the world in their terms. You cannot think, we'll just act like Martin Luther King or Gandhi. Those people are shown to you as examples for a reason, because they were under control. These were elite projects because they want you to replicate the same behaviors, right? They want you to start yelling something on Facebook, show up to an event like January 6th or the Texas border thing that's going on right now. They want you to make a lot of mistakes. They want you to get in trouble with the law. They want you to, like, it's a whole thing. The whole system is designed to get people like cows walking down these corridors that lead to the slaughterhouse. And you have to really have to re-examine politics as you know it. What is it really about? What is democracy about? A lot of people, they're like, oh, I'm really pro-democracy, but what's happening now, I'm not sure I'm for it. Or like, I'm really pro-liberalism. And it's like, but this is liberalism. This isn't an aberration. It's like, communists in the Soviet Union would be like, I'm definitely a communist, but these gulags, I'm not so sure about that. It's like every single communist state has had gulags. It's part of it. You can't not have it. It's like you can't. Everything. It's about re-educating the population. So you can't have communism without centers for re-educating adults through pain and starvation and deprivation and isolation. That's part and parcel. In fact, the gulag is like the central component, and so you can't fight against the current world order and still believe in 90% of what you're supposed to believe. You really have to re-examine your beliefs about democracy, about liberalism, about the fact that we're all the same, that men and women are completely equal, that everyone has all these canards and all this Hollywood stuff. You got to be like, why are the elites teaching me to read Orwell? Why are the elites telling me all that? Why are they teaching me about Gandhi and Martin Luther King? Why are they doing this? And then why are they showing me Hunger Games? And then I'm going out in the streets and I'm pretending that I'm Gandhi or I'm in Hunger Games, or, you have to understand that you're falling for the trap. If you're using their media, their worldview, their politics, their values and morals as a frame for your own opposition, it's like, you've already lost. You've already accepted their worldview. So that's what I would say. That would be my concluding remark. We have to start at the very inside ourselves. We really have to re-examine our worldview. Anyway, that's it.
Yeah, good stuff. And I just one more question, just the theme of your Substack, again, Slavland Chronicles .substack.com. And I like video games, but I just haven't been able to play lately. But I was a big fan of. I really like the post-apocalyptic stuff like Fallout and the Stalker, the Russian Stalker games. And then recently I've downloaded Atomic Heart, the Russian game, and it really has that feeling. Playing that game, it felt like both in that world. You're like, it's technocracy. It's both communism and technocracy. But just any thoughts on the video games Stalker? Have you played that or?
Well, I played when I was really, really young, but then I came back to it to examine the lore, and I was really blown away by the lore. And I was like, okay, I have to make this the aesthetic of the blog. And the concept is that there's this Chernobyl. It's like an alternative timeline. The Chernobyl was this experiment, and it's created something called the Zone. And in the Zone, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. Strange creatures, almost magic type stuff, and there's factions within the Zone who are trying to use the Zone for different reasons. And so it's a little bit like, a lot of these video games do explore political questions. They explore interesting conspiracy theories. And video games for a long time were not really that regulated. And so a lot of interesting ideas and interesting people would be able to get their ideas expressed through video games. And now, of course, they figured that out and they really clamped down on it. But there was a golden period, and this is one of those crazy. Another one is Deus Ex. I don't know if you've heard about that, but it's like this super conspiracy game about world government, and there are some very eerie predictions that game made about our future that do seem like they're coming to pass, like fake contagions, that sort of thing.
I think also on some level, Metal Gear, I think also has some of that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And so the clever people are able to figure some of this stuff out, and they are able to express some of these ideas in media. And it's important that we have these reference points so that I could say, hey man, it's like Metal Gear Solid, it's like Kojima, and you're like, oh yeah, for sure. Or oh, it's like Deus Ex said, and you're like, yeah, that's true, that they did say that in Deus Ex. So it makes it easier to explain some concepts. And the thing is that a lot of these games, or if you can understand the problem and you're not caught in the frame of it's 2024 and I'm just a little bit to the right, or to I'm just a little bit different from the mainstream, I think things should go a little bit slower. Like your Tucker Carlson, for example. Your Tucker Carlson saying, I'm all for gay marriage. All reasonable people are for gay marriage. I'm all for 90% of what the regime does. I just don't think that, we should be torturing political prisoners, or I don't think we should be fighting in this war in Russia. And it's like, that's good. That's good enough. I mean, he's out there. That's the radical fringe of what's allowed in discourse. But you really do have to allow yourself, maybe not publicly, maybe not on Facebook, but just even within your own mind, to be able to go and think of things in a totally different frame. For me, it's occultism. And understanding that a lot of the stuff that we refer to as psychology or social engineering or science, a lot of it has its origins in occult texts, most notoriously in the Kabbalah. And so when I look at it this way, and I see the elites as a closed society that keeps secrets, that seems to be antagonistic to the public, that seems to be doing things that make no sense, like they're not designed even to maximize economic efficiency. Sometimes it seems like they're taking a hit to their profits with this behavior. Why exactly are they so thoroughly destroying the West when the West made them so rich? Why are they doing all these things? And then, and because I'm able to think a little bit more broadly, because I'm able to lean on these fantasy concepts or occult concepts, some of them which are explored in video games, I'm able to be like, well, what if there's a different agenda here? What if there's what if a lot of the stuff like the acquisition of money and power and these wars, they're means to an end, not an end in and of itself? And then you read these like religious texts and you're like, oh, well, that's interesting. They seem to be really into this. They seem to have an end goal. It seems to be occultic in nature. And a lot of people are nowadays materialists, nominalists. They don't believe in non-material reality. And they think that makes them cultured and intelligent and educated, and they think that the elite believes this as well. I think all evidence points to the contrary, that the elites are into occultism. We mentioned Hermann Greff, notorious Kabbalist, number one propagandist in Russia. Vladimir Shapiro Solovyov literally sells Kabbalah introduction courses. He sees himself as literally a prophetic figure within the Kabbalah tradition. You go down the list of people, and they all seem to have occult views. Prigozhin was into Kabbalah and Masonry. He's the mercenary captain that was assassinated. There's stories about, for example, I wrote about this, the Moscow Torah reading circle of prominent politicians, many of whom are in office now. And what they would do is they would get together under the supervision of a Chabad rabbi, and they would read interpretations of the Torah. That's what the Kabbalah is. It's interpretations of the Torah, right? And it's prominent names, bankers, people who you'd think are respectable people, not some crazy lunatic in his underwear on the internet screaming into a microphone. No, we have proof that these people, we have Epstein Island with its bizarre temple. uh, everywhere you look, you see these people engaging in these what would seem to be primitive superstitions. So who is really the more enlightened and educated person? The one who repeats again what school has taught them, what the media has taught them, that these things don't exist, these non-material realities are a figment of an imagination. That's the mainstream view, and you claim to be anti-mainstream, and you claim that you're sort of seeing past the lies being foisted on you by the mainstream media, and yet you wholeheartedly embrace nominalism, even though it's a new idea. And right around the same time that a lot of this social engineering started, they started pushing this hardcore atheism, like to the point that it doesn't even make sense, that level of hardcore. And you see that the elite don't seem to believe it, and it doesn't cause a little bit of cognitive dissonance in you. So I would encourage people to actually see things in a more occult way. Sort of, what is psychology? If not, there's elements of occult in it, obviously. It's like they take a lot of these concepts and they just sort of give it a clinical name. It doesn't really change anything. Look at mass psychology, mass manipulation, social engineering techniques. There's spells, for example, how to trigger like mass hysteria. And you're like, wow, that's identical to what they did with COVID. This seems like just like a how-to guide to like manipulate people, So again, I would encourage thinking outside the box. Stop thinking like a 90s man or like or someone who shares 90% of what he's supposed to with the media, but the lockdowns were just a little bit too much, or this war is too much. No, if you're experiencing at least some doubt or cognitive dissonance, a splinter in your mind is caused by at least some of the events that have transpired over the last 10 years, and you're starting to use that to re-examine everything. Look into 9/11, look into JFK, look into the moon landing, look into alternative science, look into Louis Pasteur, virology. Do it. Keep going. Like, embrace an entirely different way of thinking about the world. And once people do, then we can start talking about solutions. Because in the current paradigm, no way. It's not going to work. Even if I were to gather if I had 1 million strong blog, 1 million protesters, and we all went into Maidan or Red Square or whatever in DC, nothing would change. We have to stop thinking in these terms. That's the main thing. We got to get people thinking a little bit more deeply about stuff. Sorry, I ranted. I've said enough.
No, that's the point of this great chat. Just on the last thing, though, I do have to take issue. I agree looking at everything, but I'm just not going with the whole flat Earth thing or the contagion and infection.
Oh God, no.
The people who say that infectious disease doesn't exist. Because I'm sick right now. I was with a group of people, and then a bunch of us get sick. Anyways, that's a topic for another time. But
we'll talk about flat Earth next time for sure.
Actually, I just realized I'm going to Acapulco soon, and a bunch of the people, the David Weiss, I think, is going to be speaking there, the flat Earth dude, and there's a whole bunch of flat Earth people attending. But anyways, tell us where we can best go to find your work and support your writing.
Substack, Slavland Chronicles. That's SLAV Land Chronicles, and I go by Rurik Skywalker. I blog pretty much every day, and you should all sign up to be paid patrons. I call them stalkers. It's from that video game, and there's some information there that I've never ever seen translated into English, and theories and explanations of who the Soviet elite were, who the current elite are. You just can't find anywhere. I mean, there's a complete dearth of information about the ruling class in Russia, about the events of the 90s and the late Soviet Union. I have an essay series I really recommend to people where I sort of chart the relationship between Zionism and communism in the USSR and how it very accurately explains the development of the USSR and its eventual collapse. How basically there was two main ideological camps, Zionism and communism, and this came to be Trotskyism and Stalinism. So start with that. It's sort of very in-depth stuff, conspiracies like murders of journalists and what really happened and that sort of thing. I think you guys would enjoy it if you enjoy similar content. Thank you so much for having me and for listening to my long-winded rambles.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.